Putin has done something that I think most NATO or world leaders have not been able to do, which is strengthened the NATO alliance beyond anything. I think, was it Macron said something like NATO's brain dead
In
officially? In other words, it's
2019,
on
I
life.
think he said that. Yeah, and now he said
So it's like on life support.
now
Yeah.
he said it's gotten shock therapy. And of course, also Trump said that NATO was obsolete. A lot of people felt that way because American allies were not spending particularly the money that they were committing to spend on defense. And also because it wasn't clear what purpose NATO was serving. I mean, if the end of history and everyone's a democracy and the Europeans don't need to worry about national security anymore, well, then what do you need NATO for? Well, it turns out that actually that was a historical anomaly, and there is massive national security concerns on the European continent. Some are directly conventional warfare concerns, and some are asymmetrical concerns, whether it's sort of cyber warfare or attacks against critical infrastructure, espionage. But all of these things, with Russia as the most powerful rogue state in history, suddenly NATO is indispensable, indispensable. And the Americans, of course, are the driver of that. The U.S. spends more money on defense than the next 10 countries in the world combined. And American allies all over the world rely more on the Americans for national security today, in large part because of Putin, in significant part because of Xi Jinping and China's growth of their consolidation of power, their economic influence over diplomatic outcomes, and their military growth in the Asian sphere, all of which is making the Quad, AUKUS, the Indo-Pac strategy, all these things that we weren't talking about 5 years ago, suddenly really, really relevant. So yeah, NATO and a broader G7. I mean, the Chinese were just telling the Japanese, "Hey, don't you go to the NATO summit." I mean, what business of it is China to tell the Japanese that you can or can't be involved in an alliance? I don't see the Americans telling the Chinese that they can't show up at a summit they're putting together, right? So but that's because this is becoming a much more contentious point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really. I never thought Finland and Sweden would join NATO. That was one. Nobody thought that was going to happen, and two, wasn't there? I've read this and I don't know how accurate it is. I think Finland, at least, I don't know if both Finland and Sweden, but had essentially told the Soviet Union, we won't join NATO because we're on your border, and in exchange, just don't invade us. I don't know how that promise was supposed to work out, but it was kind of like they just didn't want to push
the forced neutrality of the Finlandization. After the Soviets withdrew at a very bloody fight, the Finns and the Swedes were absolutely not on a track of joining NATO until the Russians invaded. My good friend Carl Bildt, the former Swedish prime minister, would have bet you dollars to donuts back when that analogy held some weight, before the war, that they were never going to have that vote, and that they absolutely, I mean, these things passed easily. And then, of course, the Russians warned them that there will be hell to pay. There will be military consequences if they do join. And it turned out that that was a red line that had absolutely no force behind it. And there have been no consequences for the Finns and the Swedes.
Yeah, it's really amazing. As an American, it is a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not happy about any of this sort of global conflict, but it's almost like we were saying, hey, we're sort of providing all of your defense. It would be nice if you could contribute since you said you would actually do that. And everyone was like, we can get away with not doing this. And now they're like, hey, sorry about the last couple decades. How do we get back in your good graces? Well, maybe carry your weight a little bit more. And I understand completely why they didn't. I understand the line of thinking. I agree with their rationale. We don't have to worry about this. This is a relic. It's you trying to get us to spend on defense. It doesn't make any sense. You just want us to join pointless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. No, thank you. We'd rather spend on infrastructure. That's worked well for us in the past. But it is not. nice isn't quite the word, because in response to this horrible, horrific thing that's happening, that's changing the whole world. But I don't know. What am I trying to say here, Ian?
Well, I want to
Uh,
let me. I know what you're trying to say. Let me try to make you feel a little bit better about it, or worse, depending
yeah,
on your
sure.
perspective. Which is that the Europeans were doing in ignoring national security concerns for what they thought were obvious decisions for their economic benefit, both in terms of not spending on defense as well as, sort of buying all that cheap gas from Russia, is exactly what the Americans have been doing for 20 years in hollowing out US semiconductor production and
Hmm.
saying, well, let's just let the Taiwanese do all of that 100 miles off of mainland China because
Yeah,
it's cheaper, because we
right.
don't need to worry about the national security consequences anymore. And these were corporations making these decisions. This was the US government deciding, no biggie. And the Europeans were doing the same. Now, the consequences for the Europeans are a little more profound and immediate because of the Russian invasion. But I mean, semiconductors, power everything in the 21st century economy. And you really don't want to be in a position where you can't make them anymore. So, I mean, I guess I would say feel a little better in the fact that we all kind of make mistakes like
Yeah,
this. And when you get hit in the face, then you need, as Mike Tyson says, then you need to create a strategy. Actually,
right.
then you respond, and that's we've been hit in the face a couple times on the fact that national security is needs to be a top priority. Unfortunately, we wish it weren't true. I mean, you look at the debt limit, and everybody agrees that U.S. defense spending, highest in the world, is untouchable. Wouldn't we rather spend money on other things? Wouldn't we rather spend it on policing at home? Wouldn't we rather spend it on mental health care? Wouldn't we rather
Sure.
spend it on education? Of course we would. But it turns out that actually we do need to spend a lot of money, and so do our allies, on national security. And that's an unfortunate thing to have to say in 2023, but my God, it's a reality.
Yeah, I'm not, to be clear, I'm not saying the U.S. doesn't make these mistakes times 10. It's just a very, it's almost like the one time we've been, we've been really right about something was this. I guess that's part of where I'm going with it, because, yeah, we have outsourced a lot of our safety. We do have ridiculous defense spending. Maybe it helps me rationalize our defense spending a little bit in lack of spending in things that are also important, like you mentioned, infrastructure, mental health, policing, education. And it it is hard to see how this ends well. You write, Russia will become more confrontational with the West in new ways as well. In essence, the effective Ukrainian and Western response to the invasion has transformed Russia from a would-be China into a large Iran. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, yeah. In other words, into a rogue state. So think about what Iran has represented over the last 10 years. They've been one of the most sanctioned economies on the planet by the West, by the US and its allies. Their economy has done very badly. They have a very hardline, extremely repressive, theocratic, in their case, government. And they have become the principal security threat for US allies in the Middle East through proxy warfare, through drone strikes, through cyber attacks, through support for radicalism and terrorism. And if you're Israel, if you're the UAE, if you're Saudi Arabia, you've been very, very concerned about that. And remember, I mean, the biggest foreign policy crisis we had under the Trump administration was when the U.S. decided to assassinate Qasem Soleimani, the head of the defense forces in Iran, because the Iranians were engaging in all these attacks, including against U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq. So, what we have seen from Iran, which doesn't have nuclear weapons and which has a much smaller economy than Russia, and much, fewer allies, tentacles into other countries around the world that matter to the U.S., we're now going to see that from Russia. And the we here, it does include the United States, if you want to talk about disinformation and espionage and cyber attacks. But I would focus more on Europe. I'd focus more on frontline countries and the very fact that the Russians will engage in the kind of attacks against NATO who they feel they are at war with. They're not losing to Ukraine. They're losing to NATO. They're losing to the Ukrainians that have been trained by, provided, the most important military equipment by, huge amounts of intelligence. All of that comes from NATO, and the Russians are not doing well, and they're really angry about it. And I can imagine a situation in the next 6 months where we get to a freeze of the active military fighting between Russia and Ukraine. But I can't see a situation where Russia comes back to the G7, where they start having their assets unfrozen, where they can start selling oil and gas again to the Germans, to the Poles, to these countries. And that means that the level of anger and confrontation that Russia and Putin feels towards NATO is a new normal. And that's what I mean when I say that this is like Iran. And, by the way, Jordan, by far the closest we've come to a Cuban Missile Crisis in your and my lifetimes was just a few months ago. There was a British reconnaissance aircraft flying in international airspace above the Black Sea, and it was collecting intelligence on the disposition of Russian forces, providing that to NATO and to the Ukrainians. A Russian jet fighter in operation in the area locked its weapon systems on that British plane. The fighter pilot misunderstood the order from his superior and fired the missile systems at that plane.
Wow.
Now, Jordan, thank God we found that out through that Massachusetts Air National Guardsman, the cyber guy.
The leaked documents.
The leaked documents. That's how we found all of this out. But you have to understand, if the missile had not misfired, 38 British airmen are dead in international airspace at the hands of the Russian armed forces. Yikes. In the middle of a war with Ukraine. I mean, this is going to happen again.
Yeah.
So, people talk about, are the Russians going to use a tactical nuke against Ukraine? I think that's fortunately a quite low risk, though it's higher than you want it to be. But the possibility that we will end up, in a Cuban Missile Crisis with the Russians because they see themselves as at war with NATO. And okay, it's true that the Ukrainians are, not using American weapons, at least we don't think they are, when they're using drone strikes against Moscow and residential neighborhoods in the suburbs and Belgorod and, oil facilities in Krasnodar. But if you're Russian, do you really see that as all that much of a difference?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I saw those drone strikes, or I heard about those drone strikes in Moscow, and that seems a little is the juice worth the squeeze here for that? It seems like an escalation that doesn't have a lot of military significance, but has a real danger of forcing Putin to respond in a way that nobody wants.
It's symbolic because it shows the Russians that Ukraine is prepared to do to Russia what Russia is doing to Ukraine. Keep in mind that those strikes have come on the back of days and weeks and months of Russian drone strikes and missile strikes against residential towers, hospitals, schools in Kiev and other cities, and a hell of a lot of Ukrainian civilians, an estimated 40,000 so far, are dead. So I have empathy with why the Ukrainians would do this, but the United States absolutely does not want Ukraine to engage in military strikes into Russian Federation territory.